experience that they share together that they don't share with their spouses. But then Class 5 actually only started in 1995 because that's when the internet became available. And this is when you latch on to an old girlfriend or boyfriend from high school or college days through Facebook or classmates.com or something of that nature. And you catch up and you begin to share. And it doesn't take any time because the infatuation from adolescence is stored in your brain. But it does get triggered. And we say you stay in touch with that old boyfriend or girlfriend for 30 days, you will begin to think you married the wrong person because your spouse doesn't make you feel this good and doesn't create this kind of anticipation in seeing them at the end of the day. And you do this for 30 more days, you'll be looking for ways to meet and sleep.
Well, again, one of the things you just mentioned is the whole issue of the internet. When I first started writing about ethics in the 1980s, of course, I published some books. And then later when we did Christian Ethics in Plain Language, and before that was even called a different title, but I noticed how in that time the internet had changed everything. You went from pornography, which you had to go to a seedy section of town to obtain, to now it was a mouse click away. Gambling went from having to go to a place where gambling took place to online gambling. And in this case, affairs, you have the issue of online affairs. So in many cases, the internet, although it's certainly been a great benefit, also has in many cases made some of these ethical issues more difficult. And you just addressed one of those in terms of the issue of reconnection, didn't you?
Yeah. Oh, the potential for threat to the marriage is huge. I think it's the largest threat to the marriage. You know, the millennials walk around with sex on their phones. So they're used to having sex when they want it, who they want it with, etc. They don't really understand this whole attachment problem that they have. But hopefully this will help.
Well, and again, one of the other things you talk about are the dangerous partner profile, the seductive personality. These are individuals that in many cases you, when you were maybe looking for a mate, you stayed away from, but then later on they end up being the ones that are actually tempting you. True?
All right. You know, those personalities you talked about, they've always been around. We've diagnosed this for a long, long time. We call the narcissist and the borderline personality for more frequent in females and narcissists more frequent in males. These are people that have attachment injuries. Their families broke up. They got involved maybe in too close or no relationship at all with parents. And so they roam adult life looking for somebody to make them feel better. And we hear it in the millennials when they come in for therapy or counseling when they say they have trust issues.
Yes.
Well, their ability to trust people left with the parent who abandoned them in childhood for another family.
Wow.
So it's very hard for them to trust. They become afraid to lean in, or they become disappointed quickly when somebody doesn't fix their childhood hurts and pains. And, you know, you can't.
That's right. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversations. We talk about this book, Anatomy of Affair. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Hill is considered the top political website read by the White House and more lawmakers than any other site. A recent op-ed had this arresting title, U.S. Courts, Can't Pray at Work, Can't Pray at Home. Kelly Shackelford and James Ho were the authors. They make their case by citing two appeals court decisions. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals told Marianne Sauce, a public housing resident, that two officers could force her to stop praying in her living room for no reason whatsoever. When the officers threatened to arrest her, she asked for permission to pray. After receiving permission, another officer mocked her and commanded her to get up and stop praying. The 9th Circuit Court of Appeals recently ruled that a school district in Washington State could fire Coach Joe Kennedy because he went by himself to the 50-yard line after the football game was over to pray for less than a minute. The court ruled that a public school teacher or coach has no right to engage in such expression if the speech or conduct is in the presence of students and spectators. Perhaps now you can see why the authors of this op-ed wrote what they did. If these legal precedents get any traction, religious people in general, and Christians in particular, won't be able to pray at work or pray at home. They wonder if a school in the future could force a teacher to remove a cross or to remove her hijab before entering a classroom. Would even offering a short prayer before a meal be justification for disciplinary action? As I've mentioned in previous commentaries, the idea of religious liberty is already being redefined. Some politicians and commentators no longer talk about the freedom of religion, but instead talk about freedom of worship. This moves our religious rights from the public arena to our private lives. But if you can't pray at work and you can't pray at home, it seems to me that we have lost our religious liberty. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, we have Dave Carter with us today as we talk about his newest book, Anatomy of an Affair. Let me also encourage you to look at some of the other books in the past, Torn Asunder, Recovering from an Extramarital Affair, Close Calls, What Adulterers Want You to Know About Protecting Your Marriage, Unlocking Your Family Patterns, and many others. This one is a great preventative book, and we'll take some phone calls if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But before we do, let's talk about Section 2, the risk within your home. Dave, you were already referring to and kind of talking about and even maybe identifying some of the patterns in the past. If you grew up in a household where infidelity was practiced, you think of the Kennedy household. John F. Kennedy, in a sense, learned it from Joseph Kennedy or other individuals like that. Sometimes you bring a lot of things from your family of origin into your new marriage, don't you?
Oh, you do. You do. And that's the only model most people have for marriage is what they saw their parents practice. And many times it's very poorly done. So
again,
and then the second,
yeah.
and, there is another thing I'd say about that. There are studies, genetic studies, that would suggest that adultery runs in family trees, much like alcoholism does, due to some genetic differences. So it doesn't make you act out. It doesn't cause you to be any way, but it certainly can be a tendency towards that, just like in that gene for alcoholism.
Wow.
So it's interesting what we're finding out these days.
One of the other ones that you talk about is that there are seasons you pass through. There are times in which the possibility of an affair is slim or none, and there are the times when it's just around the corner because of an emotional state you might be in. Can you explain that?
Sure. The research on that is called misattribution of attraction, meaning when you go through high-stress periods of time and you need some respite, you need something, distraction, you need some escape from this pressure, many times you see an individual, you will think that individual is more attractive, more helpful than they really are. Actually, the research, you want to hear the research itself? Would you like to?
Sure.
Okay. Our research started this clear back in the 70s, and basically he constructed 2 footbridges. One of them was very tightly put together, guy wires tight, bolts tight, et cetera. The other one, out of sight of the first bridge, was very loosely put together. He marched 20 college student males across the first bridge, stationed at the end of that bridge, an average-looking college co-ed. When they walked across the strong bridge, sturdy bridge, they were asked to they were given a rating form. They were asked to rate how attractive this woman was. He brought them back in the afternoon, one at a time, walked them across the shaky bridge, put the same college co-ed at the end of it, And statistically, they thought she was more attractive when they walked across the shaky bridge than when they walked across the sturdy bridge in the morning.
That's interesting.
That's called misattribution of attraction, meaning when you're needy, you're scared, you're frightened, you're overwhelmed, you're out of gas, you're depressed, you're stressed, you're tired, you are most vulnerable.
Wow. Lots of great insights in this particular book, but let's take some phone calls along the way. We'll head out to California first. Raymond, you're on with Dave Carter. What's your question?
Yeah, I had a question, speaking about staying on the topic. This eventually leads to divorce, and I had a question about what Jesus talks about, and he says about divorce. Is that committing adultery unless otherwise sexual immorality?
Well, and the other part of that would be also this issue of Jesus said that you've not committed adultery, but you could with your eye. So a lot of these issues, Dave, starts with the heart, don't they?
Oh, they do. I didn't quite understand the question that he was asking.
In other words, if you get divorced, is that actually adultery too? That's kind of a broader question than what we were talking about here.
Yeah. It really is. I would say this. There is emotional betrayal. And I do think emotional betrayal is just as painful to a spouse as if the spouse had sex with the other person. And that emotional betrayal, you begin to feed the friendship and you begin to starve the marriage emotionally. And you begin to do this where you take the conversation from what goes on outside of you, what goes on professionally, and you make it more personal and internal, and you start sharing what's inside of you with someone else other than your spouse. And before you know it, you're in deep weeds.
Wow. Talk about how we can begin to remodel our relationship, because, as you said, some relationships are a little bit like dial tone. They're just really pretty boring, and there is a need to maybe reignite some of the passion and those kinds of things. So is there something that in this book people can use to begin to address that, or even learn how to affair-proof their marriage?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, you need to take an assessment of your marriage. A marriage is not a static relationship. I've been married 51 years.
Wow.
My wife and I can identify numerous changes in our relationship. And if the marriage continues to interact, if the spouses continue to interact as they have and get fixed into a rut, that's a high-risk relationship. We call those satisfaction differentials between the spouses in a marriage, or what we call flat lines, elongated flat lines, unhappy, dull, boring. Those are high-risk periods of time. So you need to assess your relationship right now. How happy are both of you in this? It doesn't mean anybody's wrong. It doesn't mean anybody's caused it. It just means you need to know and check where you are and decide what you want to do differently. So one of the exercises we use for couples when they feel like, we need to change this thing. This is not what we signed up for. We're worn out, exhausted. We've been raising kids. We don't really know each other. Okay, here's what you do. Each of you privately make a list of the 8 greatest experiences in your relationship, even while you were dating.
Right.
Certainly while you're married. It cannot include your wedding day. It can include your honeymoon, and it cannot include anything you did with your children. Just the two of you, your 8 greatest experiences, starting when you first started dating all the way to where you are now. Most couples who have strength in their relationship will have from 3 to 5 items that match. So let's say you have 4. So she gets number 5, you get number 6, she gets number 7, you get number 8. Those 8 items are what you do best. And most couples get in trouble because they stop doing what they do best.
Mm-hmm.
They know how to do this. They've done it in the past. So start. That's one of the first things you can do. I guess I would also say one other thing. We had 4 kids. I have 8 grandkids. And, one of the issues when you have children, your children will never tell you, hey, Mom and Dad, why don't you go take some money and go away for a weekend, buy yourself a nice meal. They'll never say that. Kids are narcissistic and egocentric, and they will take from you every last dollar and every last ounce of strength you have, okay?
That's true.
So if you are going to spend time with each other and stay in touch with each other, you will always have to steal it from your children.
That's amazing. Well, again, there's all sorts of opportunities for you to evaluate your marital style, the windshield wiper style where you're both moving but you're not touching, or the, as you mentioned, the dial tone style, the empty nest style. But again, just before we run out of time, let's just talk about the fact that this could be not only something that a couple could go through, but Dave, speak for just a minute, since you obviously are a pastor, how churches, maybe a pastor, a small group leader, a Bible fellowship leader could use this, maybe even a class, couldn't they?
Oh, absolutely. I have classes all over the country using some of this material. And they find it very interesting. And if spouses will be forthright, what they will begin to realize in a small group like this, you know what, marriages are more alike than they are different. We've been through that. Oh, yeah, we had that happen. Yeah. And so it's very supportive to realize, you know, you're not weird, you're not unusual, you're not failing. Everybody struggles just exactly like you struggle. But you got to talk about it. You got to be open about it. You can't hide it. You can't sweep it under the rug. It won't go away. So great options for you to do that in a small group.
Again, the book is entitled Anatomy of an Affair. It is published by Moody Press. You can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to Dave Carter's website, and you can get it there. Of course, we have another link as well if you want to get it in Kindle. So, Dave, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the good work that you've done all these years trying to bring marriages together and to strengthen marriages.
Well, thanks, Kerby. Thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it myself.
I will take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. Today, the President's Commission on Election Integrity met in New Hampshire. They have uncovered what looks like enough evidence of voter fraud that it could have actually changed not only the presidential election, I'll give you those facts and figures in just a minute, but the U.S. Senate election, and that would be that the incumbent U.S. Senator would have been the vote that would have actually overturned Obamacare. So there is a lot at stake when we start talking about the issue of voter fraud. And as you might imagine, some people say, there's no voter fraud. We're going to get into that in some detail. And if you'd like to join our conversation, that number's 1-800-351-1212. We'll get into some other issues, but we wanted to start off with that. And we'll talk about voter fraud in New Hampshire and elsewhere right after these important messages.
There are those who listen to Point of View while they're driving, and some can listen at home or at work. But here's the question: where do you go where you cannot listen to Point of View? Well, if you have the app, the free Point of View radio app, the answer is just about nowhere. This is an on-the-go world, and now wherever you go, Point of View goes with you. Visit the Apple or Google Play Store and download the free Point of View app. You can listen and watch the program live or play it again later. Get Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Click the Take Action link. Learn about important issues and make a difference in this world. You can also read articles, find a local radio station, easily contact us with your comments or questions. Don't leave home or the office or anywhere else without Point of View. Again, visit the Apple or Google Play Store today and get the app, the free Point of View radio app. Oh, and one more thing, if you like it, click that little button that says Donate Now and join the team. Point of View and the Point of View app, with you on the go. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
For the rest of this hour, I want to spend some time talking about voter fraud, and there's a very good reason for that. First of all, the President's Commission on Election Integrity, which was established, is meeting today in New Hampshire. Number two, we certainly have evidence of voter fraud that could have affected the presidential election, probably did affect the presidential election, and certainly affected the U.S. Senate election in that particular state. That also relates to something else, and that is a lot of people have said, well, there really isn't that much evidence of voter fraud. So the Heritage Foundation in particular, because of some individuals that have worked with the Federal Election Committee, have actually put together the Heritage Foundation Voter Fraud Database, in which they have more than 1,000 incidents. And this has led to the Brennan Center for Justice actually releasing a report trying to debunk the voter fraud database. So there's just a lot to cover here. So let's kind of take it step by step. And along the way, if you would like to join us, I would certainly welcome your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Okay, let's go to New Hampshire first. When we talk about the presidential election and the U.S. Senate election, both of those elections were very, very close. We are talking about the fact that Hillary Clinton defeated Donald Trump in the state of New Hampshire by 2,700 votes. Out of, by the way, 745,000 votes cast. So this was 2,700 votes. Remember that number for just a minute. The incumbent U.S. Senator was defeated by a mere 1,000 votes. So you can see that, first of all, these are very close elections. Sometimes voter fraud doesn't matter if we don't have a close election, but it matters a great deal if we have a close election, and there is every bit of evidence that indeed voter fraud twisted both of those elections. Why? Let's get into it. First of all, in the Granite State there in New Hampshire, you have what's called same-day registration. That means you can register to vote, and you can cast a vote on the same day. Well, now we have the information, the data from the state of New Hampshire, and it shows that there were 6,500 people who voted on Election Day with an out-of-state driver's license. Now, the argument that people will make is well, I've moved to the state of New Hampshire. I haven't taken the time to change my driver's license. So they go, okay, we'll let you register even though you have a driver's license, say, from Massachusetts. Well, then you have about 60 days to get a driver's license. Well, as of August, we have about 1,000 of those people who were same-day registrants who have obtained a New Hampshire's driver's license. So you only have one of two possibilities. Possibility number one is we have about 5,500 people driving around New Hampshire on invalid driver's license. Do you believe that? I really don't. Sorry about that. Or the other possibility, which is quite likely, that lots of out-of-state residents illegally cast ballots in New Hampshire. After all, the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border is a mere 40 miles from progressives in Boston who might want to swing that election. When you talk about 5,500 votes and you see that the incumbent senator loses by 1,000 votes and Donald Trump loses by 2,700 votes, you can see that if indeed voter fraud had not taken place, and again, we're only investigating it because maybe there's an explanation for it. I don't know what it is, but maybe there is. You could see how in that particular case, it would change the votes in the Electoral College, and it would change whether or not you have the incumbent senator being reelected. You see the point? Now, if you think this is the only one, let me now, if I can, read from Robert Knight, because he spends some time really getting into this in more detail. First of all, he reminds us in his piece that came out just the other day that in the Granite State you have same-day registration, which means you can register to vote and then cast a vote on that same day. And he says that New Hampshire is where the nation's first presidential primary, of course, is held every 4 years. And in 2014 and 2016, Robert Knight reminds us that the state attorney general, by the way, who's a Democrat, issued a memo to local election officials warning them that they were not to turn away anyone who wanted to vote. So This brings us back to February of this year, actually of last year, excuse me, and that is when we had Project Veritas, where they actually went up there and they put together a video sting operation. And Robert Knight says that they caught numerous New Hampshire election officials telling people that they could vote in the primary even if they didn't live in New Hampshire or even intend to live in the state. So already during the primary, we have the problem of what looks like a fair amount of election mischief in that regard. Then he, of course, gives us those numbers that when you look at the data that comes from New Hampshire now, 6,540 people registered to vote in New Hampshire on Election Day using out-of-state driver's license. And since then, 5,526 of them have never obtained New Hampshire's driver license, and only 213 of those registered a vehicle in New Hampshire, which tells me that at least 5,500 or more of individuals may have done this illegally. And so, as Robert Knight said, this is not a recipe for voter fraud. It's a fully baked cake. And again, he reminds us that Donald Trump lost to Hillary Clinton by 2,700 votes. Kelly Ayotte lost to Maggie Hessen by 1,000 votes. And so, again, there has been this investigation that has taken place. And if you think that this is just a one-off, just happened once, then he quotes from the chairman of the Coalition of New Hampshire Taxpayers, Ed Nail, who says voter fraud in New Hampshire has gotten to the point of Lucille Ball in the chocolate factory, and the chocolates are spilling out of the box. I love that visual image. And so he goes on to say, Ed Nail goes on to say, in November, after examining 30 absentee ballots that had been returned in Manchester, he said, we caught a Florida woman who has been voting in Florida since 1998 and has been voting here for the last 10 years. And so then they began to look at other examples and finding quite a few. I will skip over that simply to come back to, I think, some very interesting quotes, one of which comes from the commission's vice chairman, Chris Kobach. The chairman, by the way, is the vice president, and certainly appreciate his work in that regard. But the vice chairman is Chris Kobach, who is the Secretary of State in Kansas. He's been on the program with us before, and he will actually chair the meeting. And this week, Chris actually wrote that a high number of out-of-state voters in New Hampshire in November was, quote, more than enough to swing two very important elections. Which were those? That was the presidential election and the U.S. Senate election. You know, it's bad enough that we have examples of voter fraud for state representatives and state senators and for mayor's races and city council. But in this case, we're talking about what could have swung the presidential election and the U.S. Senate election. Now, before I go any further and read the rest of Robert Knight's piece, I want to make you thinking perhaps about the importance of this. And today, you will probably not hear anything in the mainstream media about the Commission on Election Integrity from a lot of different news sources. If you do, here's what you might hear. That the President's Commission on Election Integrity met in New Hampshire. They might even do a short clip from Chris Kobach and then a quote from usually the ACLU. They're the ones right now that have said there's no widespread voter fraud existing in New Hampshire. Now, you can say that with a straight face. I do not know, but that's okay. Or you will have people say this is just an example of voter suppression, or in some cases it's even been linked to white supremacy. Now, again, just do this as a thought experiment. If we were to find in, say, Wisconsin, when we investigated after Donald Trump winning winning Wisconsin, that the same thing in Wisconsin happened in New Hampshire, but in reverse, that maybe you had a massive number of Republicans who lived in Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, whatever, and they crossed over and voted illegally in Wisconsin. Do you think the press would cover this? Of course they would. This would be front page news. The fact that we have today the Commission on Election Integrity meeting in New Hampshire in part to try to call attention to this illustrates how important it is. But I will guarantee you, and I'd love to hear from you in the next couple of days, if you saw any stories about this in your newspaper, on television, on radio broadcast, and if they did they even cover some of the things we talked about here on Point of View. And as I pointed out, what you're starting to see now are a number of groups saying this is just an example, once again, of voter suppression. As I said just a minute ago, the director of the ACLU New Hampshire legal director said there's no widespread voter fraud that exists in New Hampshire. And again, how do you spend 5,500 out-of-state voters who never bothered to get New Hampshire driver's license unless maybe there's a fair amount of voter mischief taking place? So I'd love to get your thoughts about this. 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later, I'm going to get into also the fact that there is a voter fraud database with 1,000 incidents. How do people try to answer all of that? We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A few updates now on cases previously covered on the First Liberty Briefing. First, out of California, you may recall the story of Kerby Powell, the Muslim woman whose head covering was forcibly removed by the police. After spending the night in jail without her head covering, Powell was allegedly traumatized. Her lawsuit prompted a change in the Long Beach Police's policy, accommodating, when possible, those who cover their head for religious reasons. And the City Council has agreed to pay $85,000 in damages. Next, the EEOC has found reasonable cause supporting the allegations of about 150 Somali American employees who were fired after being denied the use of their break time to pray. The Minnesota Meatpacking Company will now either face a federal lawsuit led by the federal government on behalf of the employees or look to settle the matter quickly. And finally, Bernards Township, New Jersey has given final and unanimous approval to the construction of a mosque it previously had denied. That action brought an end to more than one lawsuit on the matter and years of frustration. All that is left to do is for the city's insurer to write a check for $3.25 million to the mosque's law firm. Each of these cases remind us about the precarious position religious liberty holds in America, along with the certain need for its defense. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Could you lose your career because of your faith? Could your pastor be sued because of his sermons? Can students and teachers be punished because of what they believe about God or what they say? Can the government or even your employer force you to violate your beliefs? Get the answers, and if necessary, legal protection from First Liberty Institutes at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
So we're talking about, I guess it'd be a nice way to say it, voter irregularities. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Not necessarily picking on New Hampshire. In just a minute, I'm going to talk about 1,000 different incidents across the various states. As a matter of fact, almost every state in which we broadcast has some of those issues. So we're just focusing on New Hampshire for a moment, simply because the President's Commission on Election Integrity meeting today on this Tuesday. And I might just mention, before we take our first phone call from New Hampshire, that today, on Tuesday, there's a new state voter ID law that takes effect. It was passed by the Republican-controlled legislature, signed by Governor Chris Sununu. And the statute actually requires voters who move to the state within 30 days of an election to provide proof that they intend to stay. So this is an attempt maybe to address this issue. And, of course, this is one of those issues that will be addressed, no doubt, today by the Commission on Election Integrity. Let me go to, first of all, the whole issue of New Hampshire before we look at what has happened in other states. So we'll go to the state of New Hampshire. Fenton, WSEW, thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I had mentioned off air that the 5,500 New Hampshire voters who didn't have, hadn't registered for New Hampshire driver's licenses may be a matter of, in New Hampshire, instead of residency law, we call it domicile. And it's very generous, very liberal. So, for example, a college student from Massachusetts or Maryland or Pennsylvania, wherever, if they decide to vote and they want to vote in New Hampshire, they can just say, yeah, I'm domiciled in New Hampshire. I currently live in New Hampshire. For the same token, somebody can come in, stay with some relatives in New Hampshire, say, I'm domiciled in New Hampshire for the last 2-3 days, and they can vote. They can have an out-of-state license, or could, prior to the law that was just passed this session.
Yeah, and for out-of-state students, the question you got about out-of-state students, let's use that one for a minute, is how do we know they didn't vote twice, which was one of the questions people, they could vote once absentee in their home state and again in New Hampshire. So you could have an explanation for that. And, of course, as I said, that's one of the reasons why this new voter ID law maybe will try to resolve that. But it again, just provides a lot of opportunity for mischief, don't you think?
Oh, and I live in a border community in New Hampshire, and we have seen, and we live near a university town in a border community.
Sure.
And we have seen cars with Massachusetts plates, buses with Massachusetts plates stopping at our voting areas.
Wow.
People getting out and voting.
There you go.
And so now we can't prove it because you're not allowed to go into the polling station and interview people. You're not allowed to confront them coming out because we had a Democrat Attorney General and because of his rules. But I firmly believe that there is a tremendous amount of voter fraud. However, I also believe that some of our problem was self-induced with ridiculously liberal voting laws.
I would think so. And again, you've served as a state senator, so you've had a chance to see it not only in an experiential form as an individual that has been watching that, but also seen some of the debates and discussion that's taken place there in New Hampshire as well, haven't you?
I have, and every time there's been any attempt to make the voting laws more stringent, and there is no intent ever to disenfranchise people. The intent is that if you want to vote in New Hampshire, whether it's a federal, state, or local election, you should be a resident of New Hampshire to vote state or federal, and you should be a resident of your local community to vote in your local community. And I think our election laws should reflect that, and not, like I said, right now, the domicile rules that have been promulgated are so liberal that they simply they have allowed this to happen. I don't have the article with me, but you might look up on it. We have a newspaper that comes out with our local newspaper every Sunday. It's called New Hampshire Sunday, and they had an article in there on the Sunday, 1 or 2 Sundays after the election, and it talked about in the 3 major University of New Hampshire college communities, how many same-day registrations there were of students in those college communities, and the number, my recollection, was in the 15,000 range just in those 3 college towns, not even counting the surrounding towns. And we know of situations here at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, where I live close to, where professors have said to students, if you're from Massachusetts, don't waste your vote in Massachusetts because the Democrat candidate's going to win anyway. You should vote in New Hampshire.
Yeah. And you've, I think, illustrated the point because, as we've said before, maybe they only vote once, but in some cases they could actually vote twice as out-of-state college students, and so you've got all that playing itself out as well. So, Fenton, I appreciate you calling in today. If nothing else, you gave reality to the very conversation we're having today about New Hampshire. And when we come back after the break, I'm going to talk about some of the other examples in 47 different states around the United States. So we're not just picking on New Hampshire today. It just so happens that that's where the Commission on Election Integrity is. And because you had such close elections, this is why voter integrity matters so very much. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome. And I am convinced that Senator Ayotte and Donald Trump both lost in New Hampshire because of voter fraud.
Well, I think that's exactly what Chris Kobach has suggested as well. He's the commission vice chairman and also, of course, has been the Secretary of State in Kansas. We've interviewed him before on Point of View. Maybe we'll get him on again. Let me just say that when we come back from the break, I do want to talk about Heritage Foundation's voter fraud database, in which they now have examples of voter fraud in 47 different states. So you listening right now in whatever state you're located in are in a state where there's been some voter fraud. So how in the world do those individuals who do not want to maybe tighten up the voter regulations respond, apart from name calling it voter suppression or white supremacy or whatever? And so that's the Brennan Center for Justice. We're going to talk about that in just a minute and give you a little bit more of a perspective. But again, you can see how even duplicate voting can be a problem, as we talked about this woman who they finally were able to catch, and how many others have they not been able to catch? But this is a woman who had been voting in Florida since 1998 and also has been voting in New Hampshire for the last 10 years. It is quite possible to do, and that, of course, brings us back to some of the concerns about absentee voting and the fact that you don't have same-day voting, you don't have any election official looking over the shoulder of individuals, making sure that they're not being coerced or manipulated. And so those are all issues that I think need to take place. And in many cases, voter fraud is insignificant because the elections aren't that close. But in the case of New Hampshire, both the presidential election and the U.S. Senate election were close. We've had other close elections in U.S. Senate races in Minnesota and in Louisiana, in House of Representative races in California and other places. So we're going to come back and talk about that in a little more detail. Perhaps you have some thoughts about this issue of voter integrity, voter ID laws, and the rest. So if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. I have a commentary coming out next week on this, but we have some information that you can certainly interact with, as we've posted some of it today on the website. It's the first article by our good friend Robert Knight. So again, I hope you'll visit the website, find some of that material, read about it, pass it on to others. And if you'd like to engage in the conversation, when we come back from the break, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take a break. We'll come back, have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today. In the first hour, we spent a little bit of time talking about voter fraud and wanted to finish our conversation on that and then move on. If you'd like to join us, perhaps you have some thoughts about voter ID laws or about voter integrity, voter fraud. We brought this up in large part because today the President's Commission on Election Integrity has met in New Hampshire, and the reason we mentioned that is because of the concern that was voiced even by a former New Hampshire state senator who called in just a few minutes ago, and certainly voiced by Robert Knight in the column. It's the first article we've posted here today, "The Old Vote Scam in the Mountains." And again, if you're just joining us, let me just rehearse that for a minute before we move on to the whole voter fraud database that shows that it isn't just happening in New Hampshire. It's happening in 47 states around the country. But they're in New Hampshire today in large part because this was an election that was very close last year. Hillary Clinton defeated Donald Trump by about 2,700 votes. The incumbent U.S. senator was defeated by about 1,000 votes. And we also see that according to records that have come out from the New Hampshire state, that about 6,500 people voted on Election Day using out-of-state driver's license. They have same-day registration. That means you can go and register to vote and cast your vote on the same day. Okay, so that's possible. People come in and say, look, I'm in New Hampshire, but I just actually haven't had a chance to change my driver's license. People say, okay, we'll let you vote. Well, now, as of August, and so this is now a year and a half later almost, we have still about 5,500 people who haven't done anything that makes them look like they were residents of New Hampshire. Only about 1,000 of those same-day registrants have obtained a New Hampshire driver's license. Only about 213 have actually registered a vehicle. So that looks a little bit suspect. As I pointed out, either we have about 5,500 people driving around New Hampshire with an invalid license, unlikely, or more likely, these are out-of-state residents, many of whom came from Massachusetts. After all, the border of New Hampshire and Massachusetts is about 40 minutes away from Boston, so it's not much of a drive to drive across the state line, say, you know what, I actually live in New Hampshire and I want to vote, and swing the election. And so think about 5,500 people who are swinging the election, where in many cases it wouldn't even take that many votes because, again, the incumbent senator was defeated by 1,000 votes. Donald Trump was defeated by 2,700 votes. It is quite likely that if voter fraud had not taken place, Donald Trump would have won that state, and he would have had those additional electoral college votes, and that the sitting senator would also be there to not only vote, but also to have perhaps been the key vote to actually overturn Obamacare. So those are some issues on the table. And as we went through some of this, we also have some statistics and facts from Robert Knight in his column that we've posted today about how this isn't the first time it's happened in New Hampshire. I fear it will not be the last. But let me, before we finish this segment, also talk about the fact that because there have been so many people saying that the voter fraud is just anecdotal, there really aren't really too many examples of voter fraud. People that are trying to change the laws, trying to do some kind of voter suppression. These are individuals, if anything, are the problem, not the issue of voter integrity. Well, the Heritage Foundation said, okay, we'll take this on a dare, and they have put together what's called a voter fraud database. It's taken 2 years to do so, and so far they have a database that has over 1,000 different incidents, 1,071 incidents. These involve 938 cases that have actually resulted in criminal convictions, 43 that have ended in civil penalties, 74 that have seen defendants enter diversion programs, and 16 that are supported by judicial or other official findings of election fraud. This is widespread. You can actually go through the database and you can find examples of fraud in 47 of the 50 states in the United States involving elections at all levels of government. And so in some respects, you would have to say at this point they've proven their case. Well, maybe not necessarily. The Brennan Center for Justice has been really active over the years in trying to say that voter fraud does not exist. It's in the minds of a few conservatives that have sort of the fever swamp of unreality, and they need to just not sort of get with the program here. And so how have they tried to assail this database, which is, again, over 1,000 different incidents in 47 different states? Well, first of all, the Brennan Center does this, which I think is just really interesting. They say that, well, yes, but this is all that there is. In other words, this is a complete list. So then the argument is that we have over 300 million Americans, and we have 1,000 incidents. It's not a lot, but it's something, but it's not a whole lot. And, of course, what the Heritage Foundation says, wait a minute, this is just the tip of the iceberg. After 2 years, we found 1,000 incidents in 47 states. This is incredible. And they point out, and Rotation Sneed in his article here says, most fraud goes undetected because of the lack of robust procedures designed to detect fraud before it occurs in the first place. And in great many instances where fraud is, in fact, uncovered, has never been taken up by prosecutors or election officials, often because of competing priorities or lack of interest after the election is over. Think about this. If indeed there is some kind of fraud, and it's really not going to make that much difference because the election was not close, why do you bother pursue it? You can understand that, especially when you have already a busy office in the county or the city to involve yourself in all sorts of other activities. Well, Jason Sneed goes on to say, even the number of cases that are discovered and prosecuted or otherwise addressed is higher than the number of cases in the database. The reason is simple. The database relies heavily on local media reporting to identify cases to track and enter. In other words, the only ones they have in the database right now are the ones that made the news. How many times do we have examples of fraud that everybody knows about? It isn't something anybody bothers to pursue, and it isn't even covered in the local press. So, again, the first argument being used by the Brennan Center is that, well, this is a complete list. And really, I can't minimize 1,000 incidents of fraud, but after all, it's only 1,000 out of this vast country. If nothing else, we can see that it's really the tip of the iceberg. When we come back, I'll talk about some of the other ways in which they try to dismiss that, but I'd love to get your comments as well. We have many different states right now trying to enact voter ID laws. Some of those have been struck down by judges. Some of them have been vetoed. Does it make sense that you should be able to show a photo ID before you vote? Since you have to show a voter ID or a photo ID before you get on an airplane, before you go into a federal building, oftentimes you have to show that before you can buy certain kinds of products in the grocery store. What are your thoughts? If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. The issue of voter fraud in the news today, in large part because the Commission on Election Integrity is right now in New Hampshire holding hearings, and this is something that was instituted by President Trump, and I'd love to get your thoughts. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some calls and continue talking about this voter fraud database in the Heritage Foundation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Hill is considered the top political website read by the White House and more lawmakers than any other site. A recent op-ed had this arresting title: U.S. Courts Can't Pray at Work, Can't Pray at Home. Kelly Shackelford and James Ho were the authors. They make their case by citing two appeals court decisions. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals told Marianne Sauce, a public housing resident, that two officers could force her to stop praying in her living room for no reason whatsoever. When the officers threatened to arrest her, she asked for permission to pray. After receiving permission, another officer mocked her and commanded her to get up and stop praying. The 9th Circuit Court of Appeals recently ruled that a school district in Washington State could fire Coach Joe Kennedy because he went by himself to the 50-yard line after the football game was over to pray for less than a minute. The court ruled that a public school teacher or coach has no right to engage in such expression if the speech or conduct is in the presence of students and spectators. Perhaps now you can see why the authors of this op-ed wrote what they did. If these legal precedents get any traction, religious people in general, and Christians in particular, won't be able to pray at work or pray at home. They wonder if a school in the future could force a teacher to remove a cross or to remove her hijab before entering a classroom. Would even offering a short prayer before a meal be justification for disciplinary action? As I've mentioned in previous commentaries, the idea of religious liberty is already being redefined. Some politicians and commentators no longer talk about the freedom of religion, but instead talk about freedom of worship. This moves our religious rights from the public arena to our private lives. But if you can't pray at work and you can't pray at home, it seems to me that we have lost our religious liberty. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about voter fraud at the moment because the Commission on Election Integrity is meeting today in in New Hampshire. Of course, we've been talking about some of the things in Massachusetts. Let me mention one of our callers actually wrote an email saying, I'd been an unenrolled voter in Maine for many years. During the last presidential caucus and election, I wanted to vote for Kasich. I filled out registration cards in a timely fashion. However, when I traveled about 45 miles to vote for the Republican caucus, I was not allowed to vote because I had been illegally registered as a Democrat. He said the same thing happened the next two elections, even though I filled out a new Republican registration card also in a timely fashion. And then later he said, I talked to an individual that said this was happening as well. One of the poll takers said that they had also had some other kinds of occurrences. And we've had situations where sometimes people will go to vote, and people at the election polling place there will say, well, you've already voted. No, it's the first time I walked in. Well, somebody coming in pretending to be you actually did vote in your place. So you can see how when we don't have this kind of accountability and election integrity, what the problem is. I think, again, some of this is incompetence, but I do think some of it is intentional. We would not put up with this with our finances. If you went to a bank and somebody said, well, somebody took out money under your name, you would just be ready to sue them. And the Security and Exchange Commission and a variety of other organizations would want to take that bank to task and probably to court. And somebody might go to jail for that. But somebody can steal your vote. Somebody can manipulate your vote. individuals can cross state lines and vote illegally and affect an election, as we talked about in New Hampshire. And we go, that's kind of what happens. And this is why it's so frustrating when I see some of the arguments coming from the Brennan Center about the Heritage Foundation voter fraud database, in which the first argument they made was, you know what, that may be true. Those may be actual cases of fraud, but those are the only ones. There aren't any others. Well, as I pointed out, actually probably a lot more than that. But here's another one, and that is, interestingly enough, database includes, they said, a broad variety of conduct, including allegations of voter intimidation, vote buying, interfering or altering ballots by election officials, wrongdoing pertaining to the election and submission of signatures of ballot petitions, and technical violations of ballot assistance. And so they're saying what they've done in this case is they've actually inflated the number of examples of voter fraud. And I love how Jason Sneed responds to that. You know, most Americans would consider rigging elections and buying votes to be a blatant example of election fraud. But apparently some of the individuals at that center don't think so. I was just quoting from RJ, I guess it is, and he's in Maine, so I want to let him tell his full story. So, RJ, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome.
I tried to summarize it, but you give us all the details here.
I have been a long-time unenrolled voter in Maine because most all the parties lean towards or officially are for abortion. So I've been unenrolled. But for the presidential election, in caucus, I wanted to vote for Kasich. So I registered in a timely fashion for both the elections and a local election as a Republican. I did that twice because both times I was disallowed to vote because they had me registered as a Democrat in the caucus and also for, I think, a local election, but whatever, twice. I ended up having to fill out 3 voter registration cards, and finally, after pulling a few strings behind the doors, it's a small town, I was, again, after the presidential election, registered as unenrolled again.
So, again, it's a good example. And as you said in the email, of course, now let me have you speak to that issue as well. You found that this isn't the first time. There were other people that had had the same experience, hadn't they?
Yes. I was told by one of the people at the alphabetical polling station, there's probably about 4 or 5 of them at our small town, that it had happened at her booth to 2 other people besides myself that she was aware of.
So, again, just a couple of good examples of how that plays itself out. And so, again, it just seems to me that that is another issue that we need to address here. And that's one of the reasons why you have the President's Commission on Election Integrity really trying to see if there are some things that can and should be done in order to make it possible to have elections that are going to have some kind of election integrity. So, RJ, I appreciate you sharing that with us today.
Thank you very much.
Well, again, one of the other questions that people have had is, as well, isn't it making sense, and doesn't it make sense to have some kind of ID? I don't know if you saw this recently, but I posted this in one of my commentaries a while back, that the Washington Examiner listed 24 things that require a photo ID, and then actually tries to remind us that there's only one place where your vote, I think, counts even more than some of these other activities, where you don't necessarily in many states have to have a voter ID. Let's talk about those for just a minute. They said, for example, you cannot buy alcohol without an ID. If you're under 27 years of age and want to buy cigarettes, you're asked for an ID. You need an ID to open a bank account. You need an ID to apply for food stamps and to apply for other welfare benefits. You need an ID to apply for Medicaid and Social Security. You need an ID to actually apply for a job and to apply for unemployment. You need an ID to rent or buy a house and to apply for a mortgage. You need an ID to rent a car or to buy a car. And of course, you need a driver's license to drive a car. Oops. You also need an ID to get on an airplane. You need an ID to get married. You need an ID to buy a gun. You need an ID to apply for a hunting license or a fishing license. You need an ID to rent a hotel room. You need an ID to buy a cell phone. You need an ID to pick up a prescription or even to buy certain cold medications. And you need an ID to give a blood donation. Those are just a few to help you understand that we have a world right now that simply says, you know, not that important. We don't have to worry about absentee ballots. We don't have to worry about voter ID. We have all the voter integrity that we need, and that all is all we really need. We don't need to pass any other pieces of legislation. And this is one of the reasons why, as I mentioned today, not only do you have the Commission on Election Integrity meeting today, but also in New Hampshire, you also have the new state voter ID law that also requires voters who move to the state within 30 days of an election to provide proof that they intend to stay because of the domicile issue we talked about in the first hour. Let's take another phone call. We'll head back to the state of Maine this time. WSEW. Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you, Kerby. Yeah, I found it interesting that somebody had just called from Maine, and I had something to add to that when I was voting in my primaries this year. The only place that I had available for me to vote was a town that's about a 30-minute highway drive away from my hometown. The regular polling places were not available for the Republican primary. For the Democrat primaries, I talked to my friends who are Democrats, and they all went to their normal polling places, schools and libraries and so forth, that were their normal polling places. But those weren't available to us. And because of that, the lines were so long at the one location that I had, many people, including myself, didn't make it to vote.
Wow. Well, and that one may due to the fact that there weren't enough, for example, Republicans to man that booth or a variety of other things. But again, you can see how it wasn't fair because it was very easy for individuals in your community who were Democrats to vote, very difficult for individuals who are Republicans to have to go 30 miles away to vote. So again, you can see another aspect of a situation that needs to be rectified. We wouldn't put up with the fact that somebody, if they wanted to draw money from their bank, had to drive 30 miles to an ATM machine. Yet we put up with this all the time in terms of voting. And then we have all sorts of mistakes that happen with these voting machines and everything. We wouldn't dare allow a an ATM machine to have as many malfunctions as a voter machine has in many of these areas. So it just illustrates, again, the need for election integrity, and that's why I think the President's Commission on Election Integrity is so needed. So, Steve, thanks for sharing another story with us today.
Thank you. God bless.
Just all sorts of stories coming in today, most of those from New Hampshire and Maine, and I love our listeners up there in that area of the country. I have a chance, of course, to go to New York and Vermont and New Hampshire on a fairly regular basis and love going up there. So let's, again, get into some other issues in just a minute. But if you still want to join us on the issue of voter fraud, we'll still need to take those phone calls. But there are a couple of other things that we have actually put on the website as well. One of those coming from the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. We mentioned that yesterday. I want to get into that in more detail today about some of the changes happening on college campuses so that we are maybe returning back to this issue of due process. We also have a piece here about stop smearing DACA critics as evil and racist. So there's a number of articles we've posted on the website. And in this last half hour, if we've said something about some of these issues you would like to join us with, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take your calls, and we'll continue our conversation on some other important issues in the news right after this.
Sarita is a Point of View listener in Georgia, someone probably a lot like you. Listening to your program, she writes, has helped me realize that I do have the power to conduct change in my area and this nation. And with all of the online tools you provide, this power has become even more apparent to me. What can one person do? A whole lot, says Sarita. And then she says, and together we can get even more done. She's right. Sarita is right. This is a moment of opportunity, and together with you, Point of View is looking to accomplish a lot. This program and those online tools she mentioned will only continue being available if we hear from people like you this week. Join Truth Team 360. There are many levels. Check them out. Choose the size of the part you can play at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Going to move on in just a minute to some other topics, but we've got a leftover call related to the issue of voting and election requirements. So if you'd like to join us on that topic, we'll still take a call or two and then move on. 1-800-351-1212. We'll go to the state of Illinois, WPEL. And Alan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. I just wanted to say that New Hampshire's not the only one. We had same-day registration also.
And I, have been the first to say, in one sense, I appreciate the fact that whether it's same-day registration or early voting or absentee voting or a variety of other things, I appreciate the intent to make it easier to vote. But in some respects, maybe we are making it too easy and providing too many opportunities for mischief. Well, what are your thoughts? You've been an election judge. What are your thoughts?
Well, we actually had to do same-day registration, but we couldn't ask for an ID of any kind. They would have to show us that they have mail that came to an address in Illinois, or that they had a bill, to be able to register. But, in our state, you're supposed to live in that county for 30 days before you can register and vote for all these things.
There you go. Yeah.
But it didn't say, you didn't have to have any more proof than that. I mean,
and again, that could be somebody else walking in with it. Of course, we've just a few minutes ago had talked about the fact that Project Veritas on numerous occasions have gone in and been that people wanted to hand them a ballot. Now, they never take the ballot because then that would make it illegal, but they will ask for. And in one case, they went into the District of Columbia and pretended to be Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General. And this white kid, who's obviously not African-American like Eric Holder, was going to be handed Eric Holder's ballot, if you will. So you can see that there is just too much potential for mischief. And just the fact that we have been able to document through so many Project Veritas projects, and then through this Heritage Foundation voter fraud database, I just think that in trying to make it easy for people, same-day registration, motor voter IDs, whether it's absentee voting or even early voting, there's just too much chance for mischief. And when you have a close election, like we did in New Hampshire, like we've had in Minnesota, like we've had in Louisiana and many other states around the country, you just, I think, have to start asking for something like a voter ID. You have to ask for some kind of proper procedures in order for voter fraud, which I think is taking place on a pretty regular basis, to stop, and so that we can have integrity in our elections. So that's at least my argument. And as much as I appreciate same-day registration like you have in New Hampshire and Illinois and other places, I just think that it just provides too much chance for individuals to manipulate the system.
Well, I do too. I really think that it shouldn't happen. In our case, we're in a downstate small county in that where our precinct was not that big. I think we ended up with maybe 6, 7 different people that came in and registered and voted.
Yes.
But up around Cook County,
oh goodness,
that could be huge numbers. And we've had a little fraud before, at one time. So we only had 102% vote when Jack Kennedy was elected. So
vote early, vote often. That's right there in Cook County. Alan, I appreciate your phone call today. I appreciate your sense of humor, too. And again, for some of you younger people, we're going to have our Millennial Roundtable tomorrow. A lot of them only know about that. It's funny, Nick Pitts did his doctoral dissertation on John Kennedy. He was not alive when John Kennedy was there, but he will certainly know about the vote early, vote often, and how they just ended up finding so many extra votes there in Cook County. And let's not, again, just put the blame on New Hampshire, Illinois. I can use the state of Texas where we're broadcasting right now, in which, again, you had this one still cracks me up, Lyndon Johnson, called Landslide Lyndon, because he actually got everybody in that precinct to vote for him, and they all voted for him in perfect alphabetical order. Yes, there are all sorts of examples in the past of voter fraud, and so, again, for people to look us in the eye with a straight face and say, no, there's voter fraud doesn't take place very often. If it does, it's all prosecuted. In the cases that you have there in the Heritage Foundation, that voter fraud database, those are the only ones that actually have ever been taking place. It's just hard for me to say that with a straight face, and it's amazing some of the others can say that with a straight face while the cameras are rolling. But if nothing else, that's one of the reasons we do Point of View, to help you hear the other side of that story. Let's just, before we take some more phone calls, get into another article that I mentioned yesterday. I posted just the other day David French's piece on the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who has decided to withdraw what was a letter that was sent out during the Obama administration. Today I've posted a second article by Guy Benson, and these have to do with something that happened in 2011. That is, under President Obama, his administration, and especially the Department of Education, in 2011 sent out what was called a Dear Colleague letter that really gave universities the right to adjudicate sexual assault claims, which they, first of all, are not really capable of doing, and allowing them to have those claims proceed under what's called the preponderance of evidence standard. Now, you can go through all sorts of legal issues in that regard, but it was all based upon some flawed data. And the other day I shared some of that all of this was based upon the statistic that has been cited so often that people believe it's true, and that is the statistic that says that 1 in 5 women on campus will be sexually assaulted at some time in their college careers. Then also the second argument that virtually no woman would lie or be mistaken in alleging a sexual assault. And in the piece that we posted the other day by David French, he points out that 1 in 5 statistic is based upon some really flawed data that even conservatives and liberals at least oftentimes agree should not be used and cited in that regard. Then you have this other study that was said that most women would not fabricate a rape claim. And we have in the news a number of those that have been cited that turn out not to be the case. And so in some cases, they even say that there is an absence of evidence that might actually prove that that individual was assaulted, because according to one of these articles, a person facing sexual assault becomes terrified. It triggers a potential cascade of neurotransmitters and stress hormones, and that makes it more difficult for them to remember. Well, then it's almost like the absence of evidence is evidence for sexual assault. And so that's why today I posted another article about this, and this one is by Guy Benson, because he's referring to the senator from California, the junior senator, Senator Harris, who in one of her tweets said, survivors of sexual assault deserve to be believed, not blamed. And so the argument is that if an individual, a woman, claims that she has been assaulted, then that should be enough, and we don't have to go through all of the due process protections that happen in a criminal court. Well, Charles Cook couldn't stand it any longer, so he sent out shortly thereafter a tweet that said, Senator Harris killed someone. She needs punishing. Shouldn't we find out if that's true first, or why are you defending the murderer? In other words, you can make a claim that, in this case, he's having some fun at her expense, that she's a murderer, and so that's enough because we don't really need due process. And, of course, that is the real concern that many people have been really raising, is that right now we have a situation in which some of these sexual assault cases are being tried on campus. And because of that, individuals sometimes do not have a chance to interview the witnesses, to actually confront their accuser, all the kinds of things that we allow and require in a criminal court. And so as a result, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos has said that there are going to be a few things that we're going to do. First of all, to acknowledge that sexual assault is an evil abomination, as Guy Benson talks about in his article. Number two, that due process for the accused party is a central and essential part of this idea of innocent until proven guilty. And then, as well, number three, allegations from victims are often true and ought to be taken extremely seriously by authorities. But the argument is, let's let that happen in a criminal court of law. Let's not run into what in some cases turned out to be almost a kangaroo type of court on the college campus. So again, I've posted a couple of these articles. I know we're sort of premature. This thing is going to hit the fan no time soon. And I wanted you to have some of those articles ahead of time because you cannot believe the reaction to the Secretary of Education saying, we need to give the people that are accused due process. Sounds like a good idea to me. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A few updates now on cases previously covered on the First Liberty Briefing. First, out of California, you may recall the story of Kerby Powell, the Muslim woman whose head covering was forcibly removed by the police. After spending the night in jail without her head covering, Powell was allegedly traumatized. Her lawsuit prompted a change in the Long Beach Police's policy, accommodating, when possible, those who cover their head for religious reasons. And the City Council has agreed to pay $85,000 in damages. Next, the EEOC has found reasonable cause supporting the allegations of about 150 Somali American employees who were fired after being denied the use of their break time to pray. The Minnesota Meatpacking Company will now either face a federal lawsuit led by the federal government on behalf of the employees or look to settle the matter quickly. And finally, Bernards Township, New Jersey has given final and unanimous approval to the construction of a mosque it previously had denied. That action brought an end to more than one lawsuit on the matter and years of frustration. All that is left to do is for the city's insurer to write a check for $3.25 million to the mosque's law firm. Each of these cases remind us about the precarious position religious liberty holds in America, along with the certain need for its defense. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Could you lose your career because of your faith? Could your pastor be sued because of his sermons? Can students and teachers be punished because of what they believe about God or what they say? Can the government or even your employer force you to violate your beliefs? Get the answers, and if necessary, legal protection from First Liberty Institutes at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Wanted to change topics again, but again, I'll take some calls if you want to address anything we've covered so far. Of course, there'll be an opportunity tomorrow with our Millennial Roundtable. Nick Pitts will be with us, Chelsea Yeoman, and we'll get into some of that as well. The fourth article I've posted here today has to do with DACA, which we've talked about before, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This one's by J.T. Vaden, and it appeared somewhere else, but then was reprinted as well. He blogs at, or he or she, I don't even know who that is, to be perfectly honest, at culturalconservative.net. And this was something that I thought was very helpful in light of the overreaction, if you will, to the decision by the Trump administration. And I keep seeing some of these comments, and I'm just like, where are these coming from? Other than, of course, if you hate Donald Trump in the first place, you're going to make those kind of comments. But here, this particular article says that for more than 16 years, senators and congressmen have been trying to pass bills giving legal status to people who illegally immigrated to the United States as children. The latest iteration have the name with the initials DREAM, D-R-E-A-M, so the beneficiaries of the proposed law came to be known as Dreamers. When the DREAM Act died in the Senate in 2010, President Obama circumvented the Congress and unilaterally granted 800,000 dreamers the right to live and work in America. That particular action, as we've mentioned, is called DACA, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So that's the history. Now, what did the Trump administration do? Well, again, the writer here says the Trump administration recently announced that it would phase out DACA. The White House emphasized that it would not target dreamers for deportation and that it would allow many dreamers to renew their legal status for another 2-year term. Since the president's announcement, he has even suggested that he will extend dreamers' temporary legal status again and again until Congress grants them permanent relief. I do hope that Congress doesn't use that assumption, that instead Congress has a responsibility by March 5th of 2018 to have addressed this issue. But if you were to not read the news or pay attention to what Donald Trump has done, you would think that he is ready to deport these individuals, and this is one of the worst things this president has done. Let me go back to the article that we've posted here. He says, despite the complexity of the facts, celebrities rushed to Twitter to accuse the president of evil, prejudice, and cowardice. Mia Farrow and Morgan Fairchild retweeted a Washington Post article entitled "Ending DACA Would Be Trump's Most Evil Act." Hamilton creator Lin-Manuel Miranda said, "The bad man Trump continues to do bad." Fifth Harmony singer Lauren tweeted a little more vitriol, telling the president, "You disgust me. You and your squad of Republican elite cowards are truly sick humans." Movie executive Franklin Leonard made a not-so-subtle racist accusation. Jim Crow was the rule of the law, too. And, of course, we have Senator Bernie Sanders, who called the administration's move one of the ugliest and cruelest decisions ever made by a president in modern history. Michael Moore claims that protesting the end of DACA is necessary if we are ever to be a decent country. As we said last week in our Millennial Roundtable, both Nick Pitts and Chelsea and I were all saying, I don't understand all the reaction here. What it does is say you still can renew your exemption. Nobody is going to be deported. And there is an onus that is put on Congress to do something about this March 5th. And as we just pointed out a minute ago, if Congress once again misses a deadline, which it's real good at doing these days, isn't it? Then he will just simply extend the temporary legal status again and again until Congress finally addresses the issue, which is the constitutional way to do it. So the point this writer is making is that dreamers are a sympathetic group, and their advocates are clearly motivated by compassion, but are critics of the DREAM Act and DACA motivated by cruelty. And he points out that according to social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who we quoted last week in our Millennial Roundtable, compassion is only one of several distinct foundations for morality. Those who support ending DACA are not fighting to spread evil in the world. They are instead drawing their conclusions from a different moral foundation. Haidt, again, a political liberal, explains in his book, The Righteous Mind, that people on the left tend to emphasize liberty and caring in their moral reasoning. On the other hand, political conservatives make their moral judgment based on a wider range of moral criteria. Liberty and caring are important factors for conservatives too, but so are fairness, loyalty, and respect for authority. And so the writer says if you read what DACA critics are writing, you'll find arguments based on all these moral foundations. For example, on fairness, they say it's not fair that children of illegal immigrants should get more privileges than the children of people who followed the rules. On the issue of loyalty, as Americans, we need to watch out for America first, and every university spot or job taken by a dreamer is a position an American cannot have. And then what about respect for authority? Everyone, including the president, should obey the law, and the law currently does not allow dreamers to live or work in the United States. While these arguments are not unassailable, he says, they are hardly rooted in cruelty and racism. Goes on to talk about how this has been blown out of proportion, and I would certainly agree, but nevertheless, I wanted to post that article as well, because perhaps you have people that are on your Facebook posts or maybe Twitter accounts or other individuals you're interacting with that say, I just can't believe how evil the president was for doing what, frankly, doesn't seem that controversial, unless, of course, you hate Donald Trump in the first place. But I wanted to give you that article again just so that you would have some of that information. Most importantly, that first article today, I thought it was important, if for no other reason than the President's Commission on Voter Integrity and Election Integrity is meeting today. You're going to be hearing more about that in the future. And as we've already pointed out a couple of times today on the program, it is quite possible that voter fraud actually turned the election both of Hillary Clinton and had her defeating Donald Trump by 2,700 votes. And it's virtually certain that the defeat of the incumbent U.S. Senator in New Hampshire was changed simply because of voter fraud. So another one of those issues that we wanted to bring to you. And as you hear more about this over the next couple of days, wanted to, if nothing else, give you that opportunity to get some other answers to that particular question. Let me also mention that some of you have wondered what is going to happen with the bakers, the florist, and other individuals. We mentioned this in passing the other day, but again, Gary Bauer points out that the Trump Justice Department actually filed a brief in favor of Jack Phillips. This is the case of the baker in Colorado, and this case is going before the Supreme Court. So you have a situation in which not only have you had, of course, a variety of different groups like the various Alliance Defending Freedom, First Liberty has filed one as well, but also the Trump Justice Department has filed one in favor of Jack Phillips, the Christian baker there in Colorado. So those are a couple of events that have transpired. And again, we try to cover some of the stories that you only hear here on Point of View and never hear anywhere else. I found out that we have Grant Skeldon with us tomorrow and Nick Pitts, so that'll be a great opportunity for a Millennial Roundtable. I hope you'll join us then. And as you go to the website today, don't forget we've posted these 4 different articles. I've mentioned 3 of them, but you can find all 4 of them on the website. I hope that you'll take the time to read the articles, to then maybe share them with other individuals, maybe even put them on your Facebook page or your Twitter account, maybe use those for writing a letter to the editor. Expand the influence of Point of View as many places you possibly can, and that's why we have the Viewpoint section there available to you, and you can sign up to receive it if you would like in your inbox every single day. All of it available on the website, pointofview.net. I hope that you'll also click on the button that says donate, because you're not only supporting the 2-hour radio program, but all the other resources we want to put in your hands as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow for our Millennial Roundtable.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.